Okay, yeah, thanks for the introduction, Art. Yeah, I'm a scientist at Aerodyne Research, and I'm obviously Larry just introduced and gave a good talk on BBOP, and I'm going to get a little more specific in detailing the SPAMS, soot particle aerosol mass spectrometer measurements that we did on the G1 during BBOP. And I have to say that John Shilling is actually the guy who did most of these measurements. Like Larry was saying, this was a very extended campaign. It was about 3 or 4 months, mostly based out of Pasco. So John did most of these measurements, but I helped him for about a week, and Tim Onasch at Aerodyne also helped him for about a week. So the SPAMS, I know a lot of you are probably already familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't, it takes a basic aerosol mass spectrometer, and then we add to that a 1064 nanometer laser that we get from Droplet Measurement Technologies, and that laser shoots across the particle beam, so the laser beam intersects the particle beam, and it's an additional vaporization source for the particle beam when it goes into the ionization chamber. So that vaporizes refractory particles, and then we're still vaporizing non-refractory particles with our conventional vaporizer, which is still in the AMS. So when the particle beam crosses the laser beam, this just sort of shows what happens. You lose coating first at a fairly low temperature. The organic coating comes off at whatever temperature would normally go to gas phase at, and then we get the black carbon evaporating above 1,000 degrees Celsius. So just to start getting into some pictures of BBOP, obviously this is the G1 plane here that we flew for 3 or 4 months. This is the government flats fire in the Northwest, and here you have some crop burning in the Mississippi Valley. This was in October, the last part of the campaign. We spent a couple of weeks flying around the Memphis area looking at crop burns, and this was probably the biggest one we saw. Okay, so I'm going to focus primarily on these different parameters that I could examine as the plume evolved. So, of course, you want to quantify the particulate emissions, particularly looking at organic over CO. We want to characterize the chemistry as this plume evolves downwind, get a better understanding of volatility losses and SOA production, and characterize the plume by combustion conditions. In particular, what fuel are we burning? And of course, the MCE is good to know, and that MCE is del CO2 over del CO2 plus del CO. So I wanted to just quickly show some mass spectra from Flame 3. This was a campaign back in 2010 with the SPAMS where we looked at actual, we took samples and then burned them in the chamber. And so here you have pure samples of, in this case, lodgepole pine, and then down here we have manzanita. And so when you're actually just looking at a sample of one type of material, you get a pretty good look at what the mass spectrum is. And of course, that's an advantage to the SPAMS is, not only do we get the black carbon, but we see at what masses it's present. So we get a feel for whether it's mainly C1 to C5 and how much fullerenic content there is, things like that. But at any rate, looking at these two spectrum, you can sort of see the difference between the lodgepole pine and the manzanita. The lodgepole pine is a lot more organics. The manzanita is more black carbon. So I thought it'd be interesting to then look at, BBOP and see if we could actually pick out anything from looking at it. So when you look at the forest fire here, there's a fair amount of organics like you have with the pure lodgepole pine, but it doesn't exactly look like lodgepole pine by any means. And then there's the agricultural burn is down here. I think this was actually a soybean field that we were sampling. And I don't have a soybean measurement, but it's still interesting to get it in there. So I'm going to talk in detail about 3 different fires, 2 of which Larry's talked about, and then the third one is an agricultural burn. So this Colloquium tarps fire was July 30th near Wenatchee, Washington. The pictures show that obviously there's a lot of pine trees burning here. So, that may lead you to think, well, gee, this should look like a pine tree spectrum. But I think you really need to consider that you also have all this undergrowth that's also burning. Okay, you're not just burning pine, you're burning all of the sagebrush and grass that's on the bottom, and so it really doesn't wind up being just a pine tree burn. This is showing the transects. where 0 would be background, 1 is basically at the source of the fire, and then we go further downwind all the way to 6, which 6 is basically about 3 hours downwind. And you can see we went two evolutions where we were background and then went out to transect 6 and then came background out to transect 6 again. This is the mile marker 28 fire, also known as the Shenandoah Canyon fire, the same fire, a couple different names. But at any rate, again, it's mainly pine trees being burned is what it looks like. But again, when you look at the mass spectrum, you can really see that it's not a pure lodgepole pine burn by any means. You've got underbrush that's also being burned up. And again, you can see we have 2 basic evolutions where we do transects 1 through 5, come back, and then do 1 through 5 again. And this time we got about 2.5 hours downwind at the farthest out. So this is a crop burn, and on this date, we actually went to about 7 or 8 different burns. And so you see these individual spikes here. This is when we made a pass basically through a burn. Now, we weren't able to get different transects with these. These were by and large too small to do that. So we just went by, got a good pass, got a good 1-point sample of it. So I'm showing organic to CO here, del organic over del CO. And I thought it'd be useful to look at the paper by Yost de Gouw, which basically shows a lot of urban emissions, del organic to del CO, and then biomass burning emissions, del organic to del CO. And you can see what kind of ranges you have. And so in the urban emissions, it's going up to about 100 here where you have POA and SOA mixed together here. And then in the biomass burning emissions, you get up to about 200 here. And again, these are not measurements right at a fire. These are just measurements that we think are affected by biomass burning. You know, they're ambient measurements where we think there was a biomass burning effect, basically. Now, these measurements, which of course are pure plumes that we're sampling, for the Shenandoah Canyon fire, we got an average of about 226. So that's obviously over this 200 number. So we have, you know, pretty high, really high enhancement of organic over CO. The Colloquium tarps was about 172, which would be on this graph. It's up here in the POA, SOA area. And then the agricultural burn was extremely high. It was 430. So that's obviously well off of this page. So I wanted to take a look at, you know, specifically as we evolve these transects and get further downwind, what goes up, what goes down, basically. So organics, what organics go down is a function of total organics. And so levoglucosan, we know, it's a biomass burning marker, organic biomass burning marker. It's C2H4O2, and you can look at how its ratio to total org changes. And I've got the 726 burn is the circles, early and late, so, you know, dark and light. 730, the Colloquium tarps, is triangles, and then the agricultural burn is just 1 point. It's this square up here. So you can see what fraction you have of levoglucosan to total, and you can see how it evolves as we get further downwind. And so that's obviously going down. And if we look at primary hydrocarbons, so this is C4H9, and it's also going down as we get further downwind. And, you know, this is probably what you would expect, but you have to do the measurement and verify it, obviously. So organics that are increasing with plume, or that are increasing with transect and time evolution, I took a look here at CHO2 over C3H7. So this is a oxidized organic over a primary. And you can see that obviously as you go further along in time, the CHO2 is growing in relative to the C3H7. So you are seeing the oxidized grow in there. Also, if you look at MZ org over total org, you can see that it's growing as we go further out in transect. So evidence that, yeah, the oxidized particles are growing in the plume. And then I just wanted to show this real quick just so you could see how we actually are fitting these. I've got a CHO2 here, and I've got a C3H7. So we're actually fitting these at each peak. We're not just saying, okay, it's this mass number. This is high resolution, and we're fitting these peaks. So the org-44 increase that you see here, you could wonder, well, is that really going up, or is that just that the org and the denominator is going down? And so I wanted to take a better look at that. And in the case of Shenandoah Canyon, yeah, I've got org-44 over CO here, and you can clearly see that it's going up. That tells a nice, clean story. So, okay, fine, we're growing, the oxidized species are going up here, simple. But of course, I wanted to get more data, and so that made things more confusing, right? Yeah, I throw the Colloquium tarps fire on, and it actually doesn't go up as we go out in transect space. And so I guess the denominator must be, the total org must be dominating that apparent org 44 increase over org that you see. And so it's the evaporation of org in this case that's really leading to this. Another thing I wanted to look at was MCEs. And so, you know, one would be 100% efficient. And, you know, you can see they're varying from about 0.94 to about 0.89, maybe at the source. Now, I was expecting them, in theory, they ought to remain constant as we go downwind, I think, because they're conserved, CO2 and CO. In these two cases, we actually do have a drop in MCE as we go further downwind. I'd like to look at more data and, you know, see what happens as we look at more plumes. Like Larry was saying, there's a lot of variability depending on, you know, what you sample, or where you're at when you sample exactly. So in conclusion, we looked at the evolution of biomass burning, got a lot of insight into how the plumes evolve. Levoglucosan over org goes down, hydrocarbons over org go down, your primary hydrocarbons as expected, but we verified it. Oxidation was definitely increasing with plume age. One thing that I thought going in was, well, maybe I'll be able to pick out a lodgepole pine plume, and it became obvious that I wasn't going to be able to do that as I looked at the data. These forest fires really are a mix of different species. I will say that the mass spectrum is still very different from what you would see with, you know, diesel or some other source that wasn't biomass at all. But it's just within the biomass, it's hard to pick out what your exact source is. We need to do a lot more work on plume analysis to better figure out the MCE and the org 44 over CO story. And future studies of biomass burning in chambers, particularly looking at flaming phase, because I don't have much flaming phase data with the SP, I think would be really useful to compare with the data set. And that's all I have. Thanks to the G1 flight crew and ground crew, and to DOE on ARM for funding and logistical support. I'll take any questions you have. Thanks. If it's time.
It's fine. Do you have any questions? Please.
Yeah.
I guess I just have a general question, and Larry kind of brought up the idea of having to do a pure Lagrangian experiment and looking at aging over time, because how well do we know that the emissions are constant?
Right, definitely. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's a good point, and we don't know, and it's definitely a variable. I mean, the fire may be twice as high at one point than it relative to an hour later. It could go down by a factor of 2 in an hour. That's certainly possible. I guess this is where the more data points you get, the better you can deal with that issue, because it'll average out, I think. I mean, you know, that if you do 10 fires, you know, how much of those, I think more data will sort of smooth out those, hopefully. But yeah, it's a real point that the fire is going up and down. And of course, that MCE change that you see could also be an indication of that, right? I mean, maybe it was really efficient at one point in time and less efficient at another point in time, and so that's what you're seeing. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank Ed again.